In the quiet minutes before dawn, long before the bright studio lights switched on and the familiar music of the broadcast filled living rooms across America, Craig Melvin often sat alone with a cup of coffee, reading through the day's developing stories with a thoughtful stillness that only those who have spent years in journalism truly understand. To millions of viewers, Craig represented calm reliability, someone who could guide them through a complicated world with clarity and dignity. Yet behind that composed presence existed a deeper, more private process, one shaped by years of witnessing the human stories behind the headlines. Breaking news was rarely just information. It was grief, courage, tragedy, and resilience, all compressed into a few urgent paragraphs. Craig had learned early in his career that every headline carried a human life behind it, families whose mornings had begun normally and ended in ways they never imagined. For viewers in their 60s, many of whom had lived long enough to experience their own share of loss and reflection, this quiet truth felt deeply familiar. Craig understood that delivering these stories required more than professional skill. It required emotional balance, the ability to hold compassion without letting sorrow overwhelm the moment. Over the years, he developed a personal ritual after difficult broadcasts. When the camera shut off and the control room quieted, he would pause before leaving the studio, sometimes standing near the empty desk where the lights had just been shining. In those still moments, he allowed himself to feel the weight he had set aside during the broadcast. It was his way of honoring the people whose stories had passed briefly through his voice. But the place where that weight truly softened was home. Lindsay Charniak, his wife, understood that invisible burden better than most. Having spent years reporting from high-pressure environments herself, she knew that the hardest part of broadcasting wasn't the cameras or the deadlines, it was carrying the emotional gravity of other people's lives. Some evenings, when Craig returned home after covering particularly heavy stories, Lindsay could sense the quiet shift in his mood even before he spoke. She would greet him with a gentle smile and the kind of calm presence that required no explanation. Often they would sit together in the living room, the television turned off for once, sharing a quiet conversation that slowly brought the world back into perspective. For Craig, those moments were grounding. They reminded him that while the news revealed the world's hardest realities, life was also filled with ordinary grace, family, conversation, laughter, and the comfort of someone who understood without needing many words. In many ways, Craig and Lindsay had built a shared understanding about the strange emotional rhythm of public life. On television, Craig needed to project steadiness. Millions depended on that sense of calm. But Lindsay knew that steadiness wasn't the absence of feeling, it was something stronger, an ability to carry empathy while still moving forward. That perspective became especially meaningful as the years passed. With experience came a deeper awareness of how fragile life could be, something audiences in their 60s recognized immediately. Craig often thought about how viewers welcomed him into their homes each evening, not just for information, but for reassurance that someone thoughtful and steady was helping them make sense of the world's uncertainty. The responsibility humbled him. Sometimes he reflected on the legacy of journalists who had come before him, people like Lester Holt, whose measured presence during moments of national tragedy had quietly demonstrated how empathy and professionalism could exist side by side. Craig admired that example deeply. It showed him that the role of a news anchor was not simply to report events, but to guide people through emotional terrain with dignity. Often, Lindsay reminded him of that during late-night conversations, when the house had grown quiet and the day's stories lingered in the background of their thoughts. "You're helping people understand what they're feeling," she once said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That matters more than you realize." Her words stayed with him. They reframed the difficult parts of his job in a way that felt meaningful rather than heavy. Over time, Craig realized that processing human suffering off-camera was not about distancing himself from the stories he told. It was about acknowledging them in a healthy way. He learned to step away from the constant flow of headlines when he needed to walk outside, to breathe, and to reconnect with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Those small moments of reflection allowed him to return to the studio each day with clarity and compassion intact. For audiences who had lived through decades of their own triumphs and losses, that approach felt authentic. They recognized the subtle wisdom behind it, the understanding that resilience grows not from ignoring pain, but from learning how to carry it with grace. As another evening broadcast approached, Craig adjusted his notes and listened to the countdown begin in his earpiece. Around him, the familiar choreography of the newsroom unfolded. Producers reviewing scripts, technicians adjusting lights, cameras sliding into position. It was a routine he had repeated countless times, yet it never felt entirely ordinary. Just before the red light turned on, Craig took a quiet breath. He thought about the people whose stories he would soon share, about the viewers who trusted him to deliver them honestly, and about the steady presence waiting for him at home. Then the broadcast began. His voice was calm, steady, and compassionate, exactly what viewers expected. What they heard was professionalism shaped by years of experience. What they didn't see was the deeper truth behind it. A man who had learned that the weight of breaking news could only be carried by balancing empathy with reflection, public responsibility with private understanding, and that sometimes the strongest anchors are the ones who allow themselves, quietly and privately, to feel the stories they tell.